Today we are happy to have Professor Pranab Bardhan to deliver the foundation lecture, and we are also really happy to have Professor Amir Bagchi with us today. Professor Bagchi, as you know, he was the founder director of IDSK. Professor Pranab Bardhan, today's speaker, he has published over, I think, close to 20 books, 18 or 19 books, I think. And today, his latest one is going to be released here, A World of Insecurity. That's the title of the book. So with these few words, I would invite Professor Amir Bagchi the stage first. Please, sir. Thank you very much. And now we are going to start the foundation lecture by Professor Pranab Bardhan. And he has allowed us to ask any question at the end of his lecture. At the end of your lecture or in between? No, at the end. Yeah, it's better to at the end. So at the end of his lecture, there will be questions, and Professor Bardhan will be happy to answer those questions. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming. And so over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And thanks to the whole Institute, the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata, for inviting me to give this lecture, and also the opportunity to have my book released on this occasion. In Kolkata, there will be a book released in Delhi next week. And thanks to all of you, and thanks to Amir, who's kindly agreed to be the chief guest in this meeting. And thanks to all of you for coming to listen to me. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to prepare slides. I usually have some slides, but today I only have some handwritten notes, so I'm going to use some of them. But most of the stuff I'm going to talk about, if you want to see more details, the book would be the best source to check. Also, let me start with a couple of qualifying statements. One is that what I'm going to talk about today and also in the book is not primarily about India. It's in a global context. The name of the book is A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. So in the book, there's a lot of things about the United States, about Europe, other parts of the world, but also about India. There's hardly any chapter in which there are quite a few passages on India, but it's not primarily focused on India. In fact, I recently had an occasion to write something specifically on India, on this kind of issues. If you are interested, let me give you reference. I was invited by the British magazine New Left Review to write on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of Indian independence. So I wrote a fairly long article for the New Left Review, which came out in the July-August issue, and that is called A Political Economy Diagnosis of quote-unquote New India, that's Modi's India. So my reflections on Modi's India from the political economy point of view, you will find in New Left Review in July-August this year. The other qualifying statement that I'm going to make is that what I'm going to talk about today is only a small part of the book. It's in the beginning part of the book, and if I have time, I'll probably say a few words about what's in the rest of the book. But in the first part of the book, the main question, I think this kind of is echoing. Main part of the book, in the first part of the book, one of the questions I discussed is this question that you see in front of you. Why are working classes all around the world turning right, not left? You might say, looking at the world, looking around the world, a specter is haunting much of the world. The specter of right-wing extremism. And I'm trying to understand it. Examples are far too many. United States, we all know about this character, Trump. Then we had Brexit in 2016. In rest of Europe, France, even though Macron won, you have to remember that Marine Le Pen, she represents the extreme right in France, she got about 42% of the vote in the presidential election in France. In Germany, even though the Social Democrats won, a very important party now is AfD, which is an extreme right-wing party. Hungary is ruled by Viktor Orban, who is an authoritarian right-wing demagogue. Poland, it's essentially taken over by a Catholic nationalist party, which is highly right-wing and authoritarian. And then most recently, after the book was published, Italy, the party that won the election in Italy and now occupies the office of the Prime Minister, it has neo-fascist, it started with a neo-fascist origin. And then of all countries, Sweden, a country which we all used to look up to for social democracy, is now, the Social Democrats are out of power. And we have the extreme right-wing party is not in the government, but is the main backer of an otherwise right-wing government. Outside Europe, I talk a lot in the book about I talk about a large number of countries, but I especially focus on 3 developing countries. One is Turkey, one is India, and the third is Brazil. In all these 3 countries, right-wing extremism has been dominant, even though in Brazil, in the latest election, Lula won. But again, I want to remind you that Bolsonaro is an extreme right-wing character, a scoundrel essentially. He got 49.2% of the Brazilian vote. So these are serious issues. He's backed by the military, he comes from the military background. And by the way, Bolsonaro is somebody who was invited by the government of India as the chief guest in the Republic Day event in 26 January. When was it? About 2-3 years, just before COVID, I think. So that gives you an idea of the range of the problem. But there's one exception. In the whole world, there's one area where the left is the center left is having still some power, particularly Brazil now Lula, but then also Chile, Colombia, and I was going to say Peru, but this morning's or yesterday's newspaper, you see the government fell and the president, the left president, has been arrested. In any case, all these other countries also mentioned, like Chile, Colombia, the legislature is dominated by not extreme right-wing, if not extreme right-wing, generally right-wing elements. So it's a worldwide phenomenon in my judgment. Also, let me make a mention very briefly, a definitional issue. often, and I also have done it in my book, often some of these right-wing demagogues are called populist. I try to avoid that term because different people mean different things by the word populism, but it's sometimes difficult to avoid that term. But let me mention the sense, the definition of the sense in which I use it. In fact, different journalists have used the word populist in different ways, but even among social scientists, there are differences. For example, when you see economists refer to the word populism or populist, they mean short-termism. Essentially, populism is a substitute for short-termism. For example, they will give you cases of macroeconomic profligacy as part of economic policies, mainly not long-term oriented, but short-term oriented. Sometimes that's called populism. That is not the sense in which I use the word populism. I use the word populism more in the sense in which political scientists use it. Political scientists use the word populism to indicate the situation where there is a hankering for a strong leader who comes out with seductive promises and tramples upon procedures, the liberal procedures of due process or respect for minority rights and things like that. And so these leaders essentially, as I say, trample upon those procedural issues of liberal democracy. It's in this sense I'm going to use the word populism, not in the standard economist sense. Let me start by saying that there is now, by now, a fairly large literature on trying to understand why is this happening all around the world. And I'll tell you in what way my approach is somewhat different. A large number of, certainly by economists, but also political scientists say, and some non-academic writers have said that this is connected with the fact that all around the world there is rising inequality. So as inequality is rising, also this kind of right-wing extremism is rising, and so they are related. There's a lot of literature on how much wealth is going to the top 1% in all countries, top 1% as compared to the rest of the population. So inequality has been used as an enabling factor for this kind of right-wing movement, extreme right-wing movement. Some people also refer to the environment-destroying capitalism, planet-destroying capitalism that we have in much of the world. Even outside economics or political science, there are people who have tried to understand this from even a larger cultural point of view. So for example, some people some postmodernists, some cultural studies people have tried to understand it in terms of their concept of what is called liberal modernity. If you want to, there are many books of this kind. If you want to see a very eloquent book on this, is Pankaj Mishra. Pankaj Mishra published a book in 2017, I think. It's called Age of Anger. And he's trying to understand this anger of the people in terms of liberal modernity. And the modernity, sense of modernity that he's taking, and he's not the only one, I'm giving that as an example of a whole group of people. Modernity is associated in this, with cutthroat capitalism, ravages of imperialism, and more generally, greed and the ravages of the economic man. In fact, Pankaj and others have traced the poison all the way back to enlightenment. I'm not going to talk much about this approach. In my book, there is a significant part, section in the first chapter, in chapter 1, where I say I think people like Mishra are barking up the wrong tree. This is not a major explanation. Let me go back to the explanation that has been offered to the economic explanation in terms of inequality and environment damaging capitalism. I don't think that is a major explanation. And I'll tell you why, and much of the chapter 1 in my book is on this. If you think inequality, yes, there's no doubt inequality is rising in many countries, not all countries, but many countries, including India. But if that is the case, something that will immediately strike you, if the working classes are really that much worried about inequality and therefore going toward these extremist leaders, then one has to keep in mind, they're going with these billionaire leaders. Trump is a billionaire. Viktor Orban in Hungary is a billionaire. Mr. Putin in Russia is a billionaire. Marine Le Pen in France is a billionaire. Nigel Farage, who was the original leader of Brexit in Britain, his wealth is, if not a billion, hundreds of millions of dollars. So the working classes seem to be rallying under the banner of these plutocrats. So it's certainly not an immediate explanation of inequality. If they're worried about anxiety about inequality, why are they rallying under the banner of billionaires? And of course, in India, Mr. Modi is not a billionaire, but he's cozy with the Indian billionaires who are some of the richest people in the whole world today. And Mr. Modi's supporters are not very much worried about that. He's cozy with these billionaires. So there must be something else. And the interesting thing is, these billionaires, when they come to power, so for example, when Trump came to power, one of the first things he did is cut the taxes on the corporates. So again, if you're the leader who you're following is cutting the tax rates of the big giant corporations, then they're not doing something about inequality, reducing inequality. And then in Trump not merely reduced, it's not just Trump, other countries have also done it, but also deregulation of various kinds, not just reducing taxes, deregulation. For example, relaxing environmental regulation. So if the environment destroying capitalism is a major worry for workers, the leaders they're rallying under, they're reducing regulations on environment. Coming to India, September 2019, the government of India, with just one stroke of pen, reduced the rate of taxation on corporations by a significant amount. In fact, the revenue loss in India of that reduction in corporate tax rate by just one stroke amounts to about half of the total health budget of the central government. So it's a huge cut. So certainly these people are not particularly worried about inequality as such. And people are, common people are rallying, and the working classes certainly are rallying under these leaders. Similarly in India, the government is relaxing many of the environmental regulations. Adani's mining companies are destroying forests and trampling upon Adivasis' forest rights. So again, so I'm just saying the environmental worry is not a major issue in the rise of these populist leaders. Much of the book is about not inequality, although I do talk about inequality. I'm going to say that what exercises people's mind is not so much, I'm just talking about common people, is not so much inequality, but what I call insecurity. That's what mainly the book about. So the working classes quite often are worried about what is happening in terms of their economic insecurity, insecurity of jobs, insecurity of incomes. If you can do something about the security of jobs and income, they are not worried how much extra wealth the top 1% is getting. So in that sense, the focus should be on insecurity rather than inequality, even though inequality is of course a very important problem. If you take Brazil, Bolsonaro came to power in 2018. And he came to power after more than a decade of declining inequality. Brazil always has a very high inequality, but under the PT, the Workers' Party, first Lula and then Dilma, they had a decline of inequality. And yet Bolsonaro came to power. So the relations are not that clear. But the insecurity that I'm going to come back to is not just economic insecurity. There is non-economic insecurity, which plays a very important role. And in the absence of a better word, I call it cultural insecurity, but it's a overall term to include various kinds of non-economic insecurity. But I'm going to come to the non-economic insecurity a little later. Let me talk about the economic insecurity part. I already mentioned that what I have in mind is insecurity of jobs and incomes. In rich countries, like say in the United States, a major source of job insecurity has been what they call the China shock. The Chinese import penetration in the United States has led, and now there is a great deal of documented evidence of how much of the job losses in various parts of the United States as a result of Chinese imports, how many jobs, millions of jobs have been lost. And what is interesting, now there is analysis, those are the areas where Trump support has been more. So there's a direct link between, and this is from statistical econometric work, people have found out that Trump support is very strongly related to areas where there was Chinese imports have been very important in destroying jobs, domestic jobs. The same thing in Europe. In Brexit, by the way, the support for Brexit is strongest in northern England, in the Midlands and so on, where imports have caused these job losses. And there are also some econometric work now in Europe, rest of Europe, exactly the same thing. Right-wing support, highly correlated with areas where jobs have been lost, primarily due to import penetration. But having said that, let me immediately point out, the evidence suggests that much more important than import penetration is automation. Automation and robotization, particularly in rich countries. But it's not just in rich countries. The largest number of robots, industrial robots in the world, is not in the richest countries, it's in China. Let me cite a study, a statistical study, with data from 11 countries in Europe. It shows that the likelihood of voting for extreme right parties is considerably higher for occupations affected by automation. So that, I think, in fact, most of the studies that I have seen, automation is much more important than trade, international trade, job losses due to international trade. So, we have to understand this, why this is happening. I don't think anybody has a convincing, satisfactory explanation, nor do I. But I'll share with you some of my speculations. On not entirely speculative on the basis of some data. By the way, this book that I wrote is for a general readership, so I did not include too many, it does not have any tables or charts. There are some data cited, but no tables and charts. It actually does not have even one footnote. Anyway, so let me try to understand in my own way. So I'll give you about 4 or 5 speculations on my part to understand this phenomenon. The first one, let me call it co-optation. Namely, even the extreme right is co-opting some left policies, or policies associated usually with the left. So, for example, welfare policies. In welfare policies, and there I think the welfare policy is a major exception to what I'm going to say is the United States. So let me give you an example. Poland, I already told you about the Catholic Nationalist Party in Poland, highly authoritarian party. They're very generous in some welfare policies. Most importantly, in child assistance policies. And they are reducing significantly child poverty in Poland. And the reason why I say the United States is an exception, United States, the right-wing Republican Party is opposed to child assistance. In fact, in the post-COVID President Biden introduced some child assistance policies which are now going to be revoked. But the United States is an exception. I told you about Poland. Germany, the extreme right party AFD, is quite favorable with the welfare state. They want the welfare state. Turkey, Erdogan, the right-wing populist, extreme right-wing leader, the Islamic Party, is a very generous housing policy for workers, very generous universal health care policy. So these are not your traditional right-wing policies, right-wing parties. And of course, we know in India, Modi has not merely, whatever his rhetoric was, remember his rhetoric was when he came to power in 2014, he referred to NREGA, the employment guarantee, rural employment guarantee scheme. He said it's a monument to the failure of the Congress government. And of course, he has been, let me say, constrained to continue, although there have been some problems, but he has been constrained to keep on the UPA policies of NREGA, policies of Food Security Act, and then he has introduced some additional welfare policies like the Ujjala cooking gas policy, subsidized cooking gas policy, Swachh Bharat, the anti-defecation policy. Of course, I can, if you ask me, I can give you lots of problems in the way they are being implemented. But the image has been created that Modi wants the welfare of the poor in terms of these policies. And now, since 2024 is coming, you will hear a lot of other welfare policies, like what is it, policies? I think it's a big thing in terms of electoral outcome. Nal se pani, pipe to water scheme. You will hear a lot more about it before the 2024 election. And even in Nal se pani, which has already started in parts of Western India, there are lots of problems. But problems are not that important. The BJP machine hypes these things so much in the minds of common people that the Modi is all for their welfare. So my first point is about co-optation. Some of the welfare policies we usually associate with the left are being co-opted by the right. The second issue that I'm going to bring up in this context is what I would call weakening of the traditional organizational resistance to right wing. And here I have in mind, in terms of organizational resistance, I have in mind trade unions. Trade unions used to be a major bulwark against some of the right-wing policies. But all over the world, trade unions are in substantial decline. If you take the OECD countries, largely say the rich countries, between 1985 and today, the trade union membership has become less than a half. Since 1985, it's become half. Large decline. Why? Well, people will say that with the trade, the China shock, with automation, the workers say that workers have lost their faith in the ability of the trade unions to safeguard their interests. And so they're less interested in membership of trade unions. There's also a significant element of the economic process. And let me very quickly tell you about that economic process because I think it's important. So at least in the rich countries, I'm going to talk about poor countries trade unions in a few minutes. But in rich countries, what used to happen is that many of the large companies which are involved in trading, international trade and international investment, is a kind of oligopolistic market, not a competitive market. So in oligopolistic market, the sellers, these large sellers, derive some what economists call rent or some kind of surplus. And this surplus there was a bit of what economists would call rent sharing. Sharing between whom? Much of the share of the surplus or the rent went, of course, to these large companies. But some of the share used to go to these large trade unions, to the organized labor in the form of trade unions. So there was rent sharing between big capital and big labor in the rich countries. That is no longer the case. Why? Because of global competition. The oligopolistic rent has declined. Not the Chinese competition, but in general, global competition has reduced the rent, the oligopolistic rent. But as the rent is getting reduced, is getting reduced in an asymmetric way. I already told you there was some rent sharing, but the share of labor has declined much more than the share of capital. For one very simple reason. Because capital could always threaten that if you don't give me most of the rent, we're going to go somewhere else. It's the mobility of capital, international, or even within country, in India, across states mobility of capital. So capital is a bargaining power, and labor has lost the bargaining power. So because of the loss of labor bargaining power, in this rent sharing, as first of all, the total rent has gone down, and labor share has gone down particularly bad. And when the labor share is going down badly, the labor might say, what are trade unions doing for me? So interest in trade unions is flat. So this is the kind of general economic description of the economic process this is going on. But over and above that, let me mention three major structural changes which are bringing out a decline in the strength of labor bargaining power. One is, all over the world, more in rich countries than in poor countries, but even in poor countries, the knowledge economy is spreading. With the spread of the knowledge economy, a significant fraction of the labor force is now professional technical workers, or at most white collar workers, as opposed to blue collar workers. So gradually there is a big gulf that is developing between these technical, skilled professional workers, white collar workers at most, and the blue collar. There's always a little gulf, but over the last 3 decades, this gulf has become much larger. Now, usually, this gulf is not just in income. In income profile certainly, but in work pattern, in lifestyle, uh, where do these people live? They live in the gentrified five parts of the cities. So the gulf between the professional workers and the less educated and often socially more conservative blue collar workers, who used to be the mainstay of trade unions, has widened enormously in all countries, but particularly in rich countries, because in rich countries the technical part of the economy is much larger. So the blue collar workers, the less educated, more socially conservative blue collar workers who are kind of getting alienated from the professional workers, they are now disillusioned with the left liberal parties, which often cater to the professional workers. So, for example, in the United States, the Clinton, in Britain, Blair, in France, Macron, they were made to a large extent catering to these professional workers, and they have been alienated by it. So many workers, blue collar workers, are voting in France for Le Pen, not for the Social Democrats, because they think they're much too close to the professional workers. So there is this big structural change which is creating a big division within the labor movement. So that's number one structural change that I want to point to. Second structural change that's happened in the labor movement is the increasing importance of service sector. The trade unions used to be important, trade unions, particularly blue collar workers, used to be very important in the manufacturing sector in all countries and the transportation sectors. But now, the service sector in all countries are much more important, including India. And particularly retail trade, caregiving workers, and so on. Those kind of services are expanding. They're a big part of the economy. Even in India, the service sector now is about 55% of GDP. So because of locational dispersion, service sectors are much more, workers are much more dispersed compared to factory workers, say. Location dispersion is one of the factors, but there are other reasons. So the traditional union kind of workers are being left out, and the new service type workers, where worker organization are much less strong. In India, for example, not just in India, even in Europe and the United States, a very important part of service workers, particularly this became very prominent during COVID, caregiving workers, health workers. In India, the ASHA workers. They are a particularly underpaid and underprotected by trade unions. Underprotected workers, they're highly exploited. So this increasing importance of the service sector is also making a big change in the traditional labor movements. Third structural change, this change is more in rich countries than in poor countries. Because poor countries, this was always a problem. The major problem in Indian labor movement is that the overwhelming majority of workers are in the informal sector. Even if you leave out agriculture, even if you confine yourself in India to the non-agricultural sector, around 80%, 75 to 80% of workers are informal workers. Most of them are not organized in trade unions. Even in Brazil, which is a much higher income country than India, the proportion of informal workers is about 50%, and not as high as India, but 50%. Mexico higher, so on. Now, these informal workers have always been less organized. Okay. On top of that, now there are new kind of informal workers. Sometimes they are called gig economy workers, like delivery services, app-based transportation workers, and so on. The gig economy workers. These are the new informal workers, particularly in rich countries, but also in India. Now, one major difference, not merely these workers are not organized, are outside the organized sector, their needs are different. You see, the formal workers, quite often, if you look at their demands in their movements, they're demanding higher wages, for example. These informal workers, quite often, they're self-employed. So, higher wage is not the most salient issue there. They want better credit, they want better insurance, they want better protection from the local police who will extort money from them. They want better protection from the local inspector which will extort from them. They need women workers, self-employed or informal workers need better childcare services and so on. It is not just simple wage demands of the traditional Indians. And in India, and this is true to some extent rich countries, but in India, informal workers, there are very few organizations of informal workers. The largest informal worker union in India is SEBA, Self-Employed Women's Association. This was not started by the left, it was started by a Gandhian leader who recently died. So, their demands are different, the methods of mobilization have to be different. But there are some things afoot. There are some changes going on even in the organization of the workers. So for example, in Europe, the largest industrial union is Germany's IG Metall. They are now opening up for self-employed workers. In Britain, there is an organization called the Independent Working Union of Great Britain. They are similarly trying to reach out to gig workers. Even in India, the new gig economy workers during the pandemic, the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers, like Uber and Ola, have tried to organize these and delivery workers for their minimum rights. So those changes are happening. And one other change, of course, the method of organizing. And I told you about the locational dispersion being a problem for labor organization. One way one is trying to overcome them is organizing them through social media. So labor mobilization through social media and networks that are much more effective, particularly younger workers, than the traditional ways of working through scattered work sites. As somebody said, it never rains on Twitter picket lines. So some things are improving through the new digital technology. But by and large, the structural changes that I'm referring to have caused problems in all countries, including developing countries. So that was my second point. First point, cooperation. Second point is about organizational weakness in the labor movement. My third point, I'm going to say, and this I think is economists usually underemphasize it, but I'm going to give a lot of stress to this point. My third point is that quite often the economic insecurity that I'm talking about is intertwined with what I'm calling cultural insecurity. Cultural, I'm using in a very general sense, where culture refers to most non-economic issues. So for example, one of the major issues in in terms of so-called cultural non-economic insecurity is what is the major issue that the right wing in Europe and also in the United States is organized around is the issue of immigration. Immigration can be an economic issue, immigration can be a cultural issue, but it's a cultural issue that is becoming very prominent. In fact, the case of Sweden is entirely on the issue of the cultural issue of immigration. Then, of course, in countries like India, Poland, the issue of religion or ethnic-based nationalism has become extremely important. India, it's Hindu nationalism; Poland, Catholic nationalism; in Brazil, evangelical Christian nationalism, which is also important in United States. In Turkey, Islamic nationalism. Now, in these, what I'm calling cultural insecurity, there are certain commonalities between rich and poor countries, there are some differences. Let me first tell you about some differences, then I'll come to commonalities. A difference that I notice is that I already told you that in Europe and the United States, the working classes who are going with the right wing, they're less educated. In the United States, they're more rural. This is the case in US. These workers are less educated, more rural, etc. It is true in Turkey. It is true, as I said, in US and Europe. Whereas India is in some contrast. In India, young, aspiring, urban youths are also going with the right-wing extremist parties. You look at the major metropolitan cities in these countries, in which way they are voting. So, if you look at the United States pattern of voting, the metropolitan cities, the big cities, they vote against Trump, they vote against Republicans, right-wing Republicans, major metropolitan cities. Same is true in much of Europe. Same is true in Turkey. If you take the largest cities of Turkey, Istanbul, Ankara, and a few others, they're against Erdogan. They are voting not with the right wing. Whereas in India, if you look at the 2019 election data, not all, but major metropolitan cities like Delhi, like Mumbai, like Bangalore, voted for Modi. Of course, Ahmedabad. So there are some differences. But let me now go to commonalities. Commonalities are in terms of cultural insecurity, particularly in terms of techniques of mobilization. And this mobilization is, I'm calling, majoritarian mobilization. So you organize a majoritarian party, majority in terms of ethnic, religion, or some other cultural-based aggregation, and then you essentially trample upon the rights of minorities and the rights of dissenters. Let me mention 3 or 4 types of commonalities in both rich and poor countries. Number 1, false victimhood on the part of the majority. The majority creates an impression of false victimhood and imaginary dangers of being outnumbered. We are, of course, familiar with that in India. Even though Muslims are only less than 20% of the population, the Hindutva people creating this victimhood, historical victimhood, and today there's a danger of being outnumbered. I've been to, how many even middle class households, even in West Bengal, not to speak, I'm not talking about Gujarat, will tell you, look at the Muslim fertility rate and so on, right? I tell them immediately, look, the fertility rate of the Muslim woman in Kerala is much less than the fertility rate of the Hindu woman in Uttar Pradesh. So what matters much more than religion is mother's education. But of course this is too complicated an issue for them. And this is the same in this imaginary danger of being outnumbered of all countries. Let me give you an example from this great cultural nation of France. In France, there's a whole range of even intellectuals, that even outside the intellectual world, this is now called the Great Replacement Theory. The theory is the immigrants, particularly the Muslim immigrants, are going to completely sweep away the indigenous, non-immigrant population. I don't know how many of you know, there is now, I think it's a 2017 novel by one of France's most important novelists, Michel Houellebecq. The name of the novel is Submission. What is this novel is about? It's a dystopian speculation about a time when France has become an Islamic state. So it's this great replacement, same imaginary danger of being outnumbered. On immigration, surveys now show all these European countries and the United States, when surveys ask people, what do you think is the proportion of immigrants in the total population? Usually they will say 25-30% at least, even though it's mostly in single digit, or if in double digits, more like 10-12%. But this great inflation of numbers, just as the great inflation, Muslims will be 20% in India, very soon they're going to outnumber the Hindus, that kind of imaginary danger. It's also very interesting, countries which are most anti-immigrant in the United States have very few immigrants. Hungary, very few immigrants. The German right-wing extreme party, AfD, is strongest in East Germany. There are very few immigrants there. So there is this imaginary danger of being outnumbered and swept away by immigrants. A second thing that I want to mention are techniques of majoritarian mobilization. There's a manufactured resentment against minorities and liberals. And the problem of liberals, the problems of liberals is that their crime is that the liberals appease, you're familiar with the word in India, liberals appease the minorities. In Europe, liberals are supposed to be appeasing the immigrants. The same technique of you are against minorities, you are against liberals who appease minorities. By the way, minority by minorities, all kinds of minorities are in mind. Minorities in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation. There's also, of course, we are very familiar with this, stoking divisions and tensions with the minorities and dissenters for the purpose of papering over pre-existing fragmentation in the majority community. And that way you consolidate the votes of even marginal groups. If you look at the election studies in India, a substantial proportion, not majority, substantial proportion of Dalits and Adivasis are voting for Modi, because the Hindu consolidation is very interesting, how even the tribal gods and heroes have been incorporated within the Hindu tent, and they have become Hinduized or brought into the Hindu tent. And this is something RSS has been working on for many, many decades. And the last thing that I want to mention, of course, is hijacking and distorting of history. These are all commonalities of majoritarian mobilization. We all know about how textbooks are changed, how history is being rewritten, distorted, and so on. But let me give you a very striking example from, of all places, from Europe. And I saw this in a recent statistical study. In recent elections in Austria, the right-wing parties stoked the memory of Ottoman pillaging around Vienna in 1529 and 1683, and harvested votes more in the historically pillaged than in the non-pillaged municipalities. So, some centuries back, you stopped the memory of being pillaged then. And they've now found statistically that this makes a big difference in the voting pattern in an area, and this is interesting, in an area where there was no difference in anti-Muslim sentiment between the two kinds of municipalities before. It's only very recently this whole stoking that I'm talking about has taken place. The next factor, I think I'm going to talk about just two other factors. One is, there is in these movements, and this is where the similarity and the difference with the left is, I think, important to emphasize. Many of these so-called populist parties or right-wing extremist parties are anti-elite. They will tell you immediately. Trump says he's anti-elite, right? And the Republican parties in general will tell you about how they're against Washington, the distant bureaucracy of Washington. In Europe, Marine Le Pen's followers will tell you how they're against distant Brussels. So this anti-elite is a very important part. And Modi will tell you about what is the expression he uses, Khan market gang. So these are the same techniques of creating the disdain of the elite. But one thing that people don't notice always, which elite is it? It's not the financial elite. The elite that Modi is stoking resentment against is not against Adani's or Ambani's, the financial elite. It's against the liberal elite, cultural elite. That's why I call it cultural insecurity. You create manufactured cultural insecurity, not against the capitalist elite, not against the financial elite. It's anti-elite, but anti-cultural elite, which I think is very important to keep in mind. The same in Europe, same in the United States. There is, however, one important factor here that I want to emphasize again, which people tend to overlook. And that is, I've actually talked to some workers on this issue in the United States and Europe. I told you about these distant bureaucrats, the elite who don't understand our problems. They don't know about the ground reality. They're far away in their cocoon, elite bubble. I think there is one element of truth in this. And I'll give you that example from our country, from here. But this is true in some ways everywhere else. So, for example, when I talked about welfare policies, when welfare policies are carried out, implemented, the left usually depends on the bureaucracy for carrying out the welfare policies. And then you hear about, quite correctly, you hear about stories of how corrupt that bureaucracy is, how callous that bureaucracy is, and of course, how truant. They don't come to classes, teachers don't come to classes, doctors don't go to public clinics, and so on. So, corrupt, callous, and truant bureaucracy. But the left depends on that bureaucracy to deliver the welfare services. Whereas, the right wing has often been associated, they also depend on bureaucracy ultimately when they come to power. But when they do their ground level work, follow the RSS work at the ground level, I think that's very important to understand the way for decades they've been working. So let's take Adivasis. In Adivasi areas, quite often there are no schools, there is no public clinic, or even when there is, this corrupt, bureaucracy is corrupt, callous and so on. If you talk to some Adivasis, they will tell you, well, whereas the RSS run Banavasi, they don't call Adivasi, by the way. They don't like the word Adivasi because aliens are the Adivasis, right? In the RSS ideology, Banavasi. So Banavasi schools started by RSS for several decades. They provide the education so that many Adivasis will tell you, there's no government school, or even if the government school, the teacher doesn't come. It's this Banavasi schools for the children, they've been brainwashed, but at least there's a school. This is something I think is very important. If anybody, there are a lot of field evidence on this. Let me refer you to a book by Indian political scientist, by Tariq Thachil. The name of the book is Elite Parties, Poor Voters: How Social Services Win Votes. How elite people, how elite parties win over poor people's votes with basic social services via grassroots affiliates, this is the RSS affiliates, while retaining policy interests of the rich. This, by the way, is not just in India. I think Tariq Thachil was mostly field work in India. But if you go to West Asia or North African countries, many Muslim countries, again, most of the social services are better provided by religious and charitable organizations. And therefore, these organizations get the loyalty of the poor. So, as I said, there is an element of truth in this. Yes, and why do they think that bureaucrats are so callous? And this is the bureaucrat the left is dependent. They point to these religious organizations. They do it quite often, don't do an adequate job of it, but at least this is the image. Let me now come to my last point on this, and then at least this part of the question that I raised there, I'll finish my discussion on that. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, earlier I talked about trade unions. I think trade unions have also a very important role, a cultural role in the cultural field. See, trade unions, we look upon trade unions as mainly a wage demand organization. I think trade unions also play a very important, potentially could play an important role in the culture. For long periods in Europe, if you look at the European trade unions, for a long period they used to be the main force taming and transcending nativist xenophobic passions, and provided an anchor of pride in one's work. With the decline of trade unions, there's not merely just an economic void in terms of wage demands, there's a cultural void. And since there's a void, it's these cultural organizations of the right which are filling in. And I think this is where we have to revamp the way trade unions operate, not just as an economic organization, but also as a cultural organization. Let me come to the last point, which is what I would call the toxic role of social media, where the right wing has an inherent advantage in spreading their toxic mass message. Let me quote to you a speech by our Mr. Amit Shah, a speech which he gave in 2018 when he was still the head of BJP. I think before he became Home Minister. So what he was doing, he was addressing a meeting of their IT cell volunteers. And he was boasting, and the quote from Amit Shah: "We are capable of delivering any message we want to the public, whether sweet or sour, true or false. We can do that work only because of our WhatsApp groups. That is how we are able to make this viral." Unquote. So he's boasting about that they can do something which other parties cannot do, not to that same extent. There is now a lot of studies, statistical studies, unfortunately not so much in India, but in industrially advanced countries, there's now a lot of statistical evidence how false stories spread much faster in the social media than true ones. And to a much larger number of users. And the more outrageous the tales are, the more faster the spread is. And social media companies have a vested interest because right-wing messages become viral much more often. And so they get more advertising money. So social media is economically interested in those right-wing messages because they get viral more often. Data show, and let me just quote from one study, data show that in the 3 months before 2016 US presidential election, false stories on Facebook favoring Trump was shared about 30 million times, while false stories favoring Hillary Clinton were shared by 8 million. Shared 8 million times, 30 million times for Trump, 8 million times sharing in the case of Hillary Clinton. I'm reminded, as early as 1710, Jonathan Swift, the Anglo-Irish writer, we know him more as the author of Gulliver's Travels, he said, and I quote, Jonathan Swift, "Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after." So I talked about the writing advantage in 4 or 5 or 6 points. So that is my speculations. I don't think anybody can clinch it, convincing evidence or conclusive evidence, rather. So that is my speculations on this question. Let me take just 3-4 minutes, if I may, on the rest of the book. This is only mostly the first chapter of the book. The rest of the book, very briefly, is, I think after the first chapter, I then say there is a movement among the right, particularly in Europe and also the United States. Since I already talked about the feeling about the distant bureaucrat, the anti-elite, and so on. So there is a movement of what they call back to the community. Go back to the community, and where the traditional forces are quite often strong. So there's a whole chapter on the community in my book. And while, for example, Gandhiji very much in favor of going back to the local community, Ambedkar was not. In fact, Ambedkar says the local community is what is a cynic of localism and prejudices and superstitions and so on. So I talk about this pros and cons of going back to the community, and then in that context, I draw upon my work with Dilip Mukherjee on decentralization. Then I also talk about nationalism. And there I posit, I think we should not allow these ethnic nationalist parties, of which Hindu nationalism is one of them, but they're all over the world, posit that this is not the only kind of nationalism. There are other forms of nationalism. There's a whole chapter on other forms of nationalism. Sometimes it's called civic nationalism. There are problems with civic nationalism. It's quite often fragile. But let me give you an example of civic nationalism, which I call it nationalism which is based on constitutional values. Now, let me give you the countries where civic nationalism has been important until very recently is the United States, where constitutional values play a role in uniting the nation. I think in India, we had for many decades of civic nationalism, nationalism based on constitutional values. Instead, let me refer you to German philosopher's work, Habermas. Habermas obviously was worried about German nationalism, which is ethnicity, blood-based nationalism. So Habermas suggests that Germany should adopt what he calls constitutional patriotism. He says nationalism that is based on a liberal constitution. And let me give you an example of an application of it. He says, quite often, the liberals say we should support multiculturalism. In other words, all these immigrants come sometimes with quite strange habits, cultures, and so on. Are all of that culture acceptable? When it's completely anything goes approach, it's called multiculturalism. In fact, somebody mockingly said, what is multiculturalism? Multiculturalism where liberalism for liberals, cannibalism for cannibals, and so on. So, whatever your culture, you follow. Habermas says, no, that's not acceptable. We should be tolerant of all kinds of culture as long as that culture is consistent with our liberal constitutional values. If some culture comes and tells me that oppressing women is part of our culture, so you cannot interfere with that. No, that's not acceptable. Because oppressing women is inconsistent with the constitutional values and so on. So Habermas has a whole discussion of the proper immigration policy that follows from it. So then I have a whole chapter on China, because that is the alternative model of authoritarian capitalism, and then I discuss why that is not a right model to follow. China has some advantages, but I show it is a Chinese governance model, and I show that some of the advantages that China has are not really. Authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient for those advantages. In fact, some of those advantages China has inherited from years of bureaucracy, and China, of course, has some of the very ugly features of authoritarianism. Then the rest of the book, the latter half of the book, is on policies. Policies to avert, or at least improve the security, sense of security of workers. There I discuss dozens of different kinds of policies. One, for example, is anti-monopoly policies to reduce the corporate power, policies of giving workers more voice in the running of a company, which the most important example in the world is Germany. In German Works Council, I don't know how many of you know, in the large German companies now, workers are at least half of the total governing board of the company, which makes a big difference. For example, it makes a big difference on the decision to outsource, decision to relocate, and those workers have a voice. And because of the worker representation, women's representation have also improved very much in the running of large companies in Germany. Then I also talk about how that is also important in the pattern of innovations. I already talked about automation. Automation is most of the time, automation is replacing workers' jobs. It's because the decision to innovate is taken largely by the capitalists. If workers have some say in the running of the company, they may influence the pattern of innovations, not just the pace of innovation, pattern. And it is possible to redirect the technology toward a more labor-absorbing, labor-using direction. So I discussed quite a bit of emphasis on innovations, and then I also talk quite a bit about international policies of coordination of various kinds that can improve the voice of workers, that can improve, for example, in the case of, we have seen use of vaccine nationalism in health policies, international coordination, then international taxation coordination. I've also talked, by the way, on public funding of elections, why I think it's extremely important. Today, more than 90% of corporate donations in this country go to BJP, private funding. There is no public funding of elections. So, and there are dozens of other policy issues that are discussed. I've taken more time, than I expected, but let me stop here. Thank you.
So now the book.